Good afternoon. Just want to take a moment to welcome you all for being here. And I know our state has faced a lot in the last several weeks between flooding, snow, tornadoes, and so I know you taking the time to be here today is putting this above a lot of other things on your plate. So I appreciate that. And if some of our districts are watching this later, we just want to know that our thoughts are with you. I know that there's just been a lot in the last several weeks, and so just I hope everyone is safe and our thoughts are with you all who can't be with us today due to weather impacted reasons. So, um, without further ado, we are working on fiscal management today, and I hope some of you were able to invite your finance directors. If not, again, this session is being recorded, so you can share it with them and have conversations about the topics that we cover today. So we're going to talk about IDEA fiscal requirements and monitoring. We're also going to talk about IDEA maintenance of effort, and then also trends that are being seen through the monitoring and our fiscal management, and then having our leadership takeaway. So we have, again, a full day of lots of information to share with you from our KDE and TASTE group. We'll start with you, Steve.
All right. Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize. My dog decided to bark just as I unmuted. I don't know what the deal is, but um, so I am going to talk to you all today about fiscal management, kind of a federal perspective. What are the IDA requirements? Some of the big picture items. So if we can go to the next slide. So hopefully, at the end of this presentation, you'll be able to recognize key terms and acronyms. There is a whole slew of acronyms that you might not know, because not only are we talking about IDA acronyms today, but we'll be talking about some fiscal acronyms. Hopefully, you'll also understand key federal regulations regarding fiscal management, and then have a high level, so not in depth, not um, anything major, but a high level familiarity with some of the IDA fiscal requirements. Next slide. So we're going to talk about acronyms, overarching requirements, and some IDA's fiscal topics specifically. So I'm not going to read these, and I hope that you all have access to the slides already. So if you do, I would recommend keeping these 3 slides of acronyms handy as we go through the presentation. And I will try not to use an acronym until at least the second time I've talked about something. So you can see here there are a lot of different acronyms, some of which you may be familiar with and some which may be totally new. Let's go to the next slide. More acronyms. And then one more slide of acronyms. Yet more. And then let's go to the next slide. So overarching federal requirements. So I know that when I was starting out in special ed, I was a teacher, and then I became an administrator, and I went to this, worked at the Oregon Department of Education. I knew little bits of things that I'll be talking about today, but I did not have a very clear understanding of how everything works. And so just in case, I want to kind of give a big picture of what the structure is when we talk about federal requirements. So there's the United States Code, also abbreviated as USC, not the University of Southern California or the University of South Carolina, but the United States Code, and that is the statute. That's things like IDEA, right? That's U.S. code. Then there's the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR, and those are the rules that the agency, in this case, the Department of Education, for the most part, that we'll be talking about. The agency makes these rules to help explain and enhance what's in the code. right? So the law is not specific in some cases, and the Code of Federal Regulations is a chance for the Department of Education to make things more specific. And then there's guidance, and guidance is what OSEP puts out in terms of their dear colleague letters, their memos, their questions and answer documents, and that is how OSEP looks at things and how they would like states to look at things, but it's not as forceful as a regulation or the law. Um, some of the major things we'll be looking at: the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. So that's the federal agency that kind of controls and governs all the other federal agencies. And they have requirements around federal financial assistance, also known as the Uniform Administrative Requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. That's a mouthful, but it's important. And it's something that when we're talking about federal funding for special education, this governs. And then there's the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, also known as EDGAR. Um, EDGAR is not a person. EDGAR is a set of rules that the Education Department has put in place that govern all of their programs. And then we have IDEA, which is where you're all probably most familiar with. Let's go to the next slide. Uh, so, so this is basically just kind of a top-down what trumps what when it comes to the statute is the most important and the most forceful. The regulations are kind of in the middle, and then non-regulatory guidance is an interpretation of a regulation or statute, and it's kind of recommended. Let's go to the next slide. So we're not going to talk about these in depth. I just wanted to give you a sense of how the OMB guidance for federal financial assistance, how it's structured, how it works. In the slides, each of these links are live links to those specific parts. So 2 CFR. So the 2 means that it's from the Office of Management and Budget. The CFR, it means it's a Code of Federal Regulation, and the Part 200 is just the section. And then there are subparts for acronyms and definitions, which are very helpful. General provisions, pre-federal award requirements and contents of federal awards. So all the stuff that has to happen at the Department of Education or other agencies before your awards are made. Then there's post-federal award requirements. That's a lot of stuff that happens with the state and with the districts. Cost principles, that's a really important piece of, can I use my money for this? And then audit requirements of, somebody's going to come look and see if what I used my money for was okay. And then there's appendices that cover all kinds of special programs like higher ed and tribal governments and things like that. So that's how it's set up. Um, and if there's any if any finance managers in the audience today, you're probably very familiar with all these things. But I know as a special ed person, when I first started, I was not familiar with these things. So let's go to the next slide. EDGAR, the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, is divided up into several parts, but the most important parts for you all as new doses are the 4 parts that are here on the slide. So direct grant programs, those are things that, like, you have a direct grant from the federal government, right? So it's not going through KDE. It goes straight to you. So there are some of those. So that's Part 75. And the 34 in front of the CFR means Department of Education. So if you see a 34, you know it's Department of Education. If you see it's a 2, you know it's OMB. Part 76 is state administered programs. This is the funds that go to KDE and then flow through to you all as your IDA grants. And then Part 81 is General Education Provisions Act enforcement. So this is kind of the way the Department of Education makes sure that things are done right. And if they're not, kind of what actions, what the consequences are of not doing things correctly. And then Edgar also includes Part 99, which is FERPA. Let's go to the next slide. So IDEA, so the statute, Title 20 USC Chapter 33, and then it's broken up into general provisions. Part B, which is what you're all responsible for as doses in your district. And then there's Part C, which is infants and toddlers. And then Part D is national activities to improve education of children with disabilities. This is where different technical assistance centers get their funding. The IRIS Center, if you're familiar with them, is funded from this. Lots of professional development, lots of teacher preparation things are funded through Part D. So that's kind of how the IDA statute is set up. Let's go to the next slide. And then the regulations for IDA, Title 34 means it's the Department of Education. Part 300 is where you would look to find all of the regulations applicable to Part B of IDEA. Let's go to the next slide. So we'll do a quick fiscal overview. We'll talk about some of the statutory requirements to have fiscal components. We'll talk about IDA's funding in 2024, which is the year we're currently in. And then we'll talk about what IDA full funding means, because I know when I was first starting out, I heard all kinds of things about it, but I didn't know what it was. And so we'll talk about that. Let's go to the next slide. So here are the different sections of IDA Part B in the law, and all of the font that is red means that at least somewhere in those sections there is something related to an IDA fiscal requirement. Allotment, use of funds, authorization of appropriations, that's pretty straightforward. Those words kind of scream fiscal. State eligibility, that doesn't scream fiscal, but you have to be eligible in order to get the money. Same with local educational agency eligibility, and then preschool grants. Let's go to the next slide. So IDA funding right now, nationally, so this is not specific to Kentucky, this is the whole nation, all 60 states, territories. IDA Part B, Section 611, which is for 3 through 21. Congress allocated $14.2 billion. IDA Part B, Section 619, so the preschool program, ages 3 through 5, that program is only funded at $420 million. So that's like orders of magnitude less. IDA Part C, which is the birth to 3, $540 million. So also orders of magnitude less than what we're talking about with the main pot of money. And then 257 and change is IDA Part D. So that's all the programs that pay to support teacher prep, technical assistance, those types of things. And then special education is also included in it. This year it was 36 million. So if you want to look at historical data and see what FFY 2023 was, or what federal fiscal year 2017 was, whatever year you want to look at, you can click on that budget table link. I think it still works. Not everything at the Department of Education has been working lately, but I think that one was working like a week and a half ago. So you should be able to see kind of what the funding's been over time. Let's go to the next slide. So what is IDA full funding? IDA full funding does not mean that every dollar that can be attributed to the education of a child with a disability is funded from the federal government. That's not what that means. Yes, thank you, Chris. Sometimes we talk about Section 611, 619, 612, 616, and sometimes we say it's 1411 or 1419, and it just has to do with how they number statutes once they're passed. So the original intent back in 1975, when I was born, the idea was that there would be 40% of the estimated excess cost of educating a child with a disability would be covered by the IDA grants. And that's calculated as 40% of the national average per pupil expenditure times the number of children with disabilities. So that's what full funding means. It means 40% of the extra cost. In normal years, the percent that's funded by IDA is between 12 and 18. It's gotten up to 18% during the ARA period back in 2009-10, and it got there again probably close to that in the recent past with the ARP funds. Um, so during ARA, it actually reached 33%. So almost double the normal year because every district got almost double the amount of funding back then. Full funding bills, you'll hear about it every term. Every congressional term is a 2-year cycle, and every time somebody introduces an IDA full funding bill, and then I think somebody on staff says, "You know how much that'll cost? You sure you want to do that?" And then people don't vote on it. So it's nice to know people care until they find out how much it actually costs, and then it doesn't increase that much. So that's IDA full funding. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, I'm turning it over, excuse me, to Gary. So unless there's any questions about what I presented, I don't see any in the chat. All right, take it away, Gary.
All right, thank you, and good afternoon. This is our agenda for the KD OSEEL fiscal monitoring or fiscal team. I'll be going over the grant management application and planning system GMAP, basically on part dealing with the IDEA funding application. Chris will later be going over the MOE and allocations, and then trends and fiscal monitoring will be covered by Darnell, McIntosh, and Meredith Sloan. Next slide, please. You're probably not going to be familiar with GMAP as I am because you're only going to be in it once, twice, 2, 3 times a year. So it's not a system we're using every day. So in the system, there are some resources that can help you and guide you anytime that you need to use it. And you don't even have to log in to access these resources. You just click on the KDE resources on the menu there. It then goes down, you scroll down to the IDA basic and IDA preschool information, expand that, and then you'll see a list of different resources that are available in the system for you. And these are updated from time to time, especially in the spring, right before the new application is going to become available. But it has such things as the funding matrix. It has the information on how to do the PSP8 page, the personnel details page, how to upload documents, and so forth. Okay, next slide, please. In GMAP, there are various user roles for the IDEA funding application. As the DOST, you probably have been given the role of IDEA update and IDEA director. They're basically the same. Both can make edits and changes to the draft started and revision started, but you need to be the IDA director because that one then has the ability to, once they've made the changes, made the edits, to change it to draft completed and revision completed, which sends it on up the line, which the next person will be the finance officer, and then the superintendent. All those must approve it before it comes to the Kentucky Department of Education. Another role that you need to be very familiar with is user access administrator, listed at the bottom. Every district has one. When GMAP was created, we decided that the districts should be the ones that would assign user roles. People at KD cannot assign you to any of these roles. So it's very important you know who the user access administrator is, because some districts have run into some issues getting their funding application up through the process because in late June, their finance officer and their superintendent both were retiring or changing to another district. And if some districts, the user access administrator was also the superintendent. And so they had difficulty getting people assigned to those new roles. So it's very important that you know who that user access administrator is. You can find it in the address book on the menu of GMAP. And if you have difficulty finding that, please contact me and I can let you know who your district user access administrator is. Next slide, please. Okay, when you log into GMAP, you'll go to the funding applications page and it'll show you the current active applications. And of course, you're concerned with IDA, but there's 2 drop-down menus there that are important for you. The first one is by year. you can click on that year and go back and look at the previous funding applications. If you're a brand new dose, you can go on that and look at 2024, 2023, 2022, look what the previous dose had done with the funding application. Now, the next column there says all active applications. You can toggle and change that then to approved applications, and it will show you all the revisions. Revision 0 is the original application. And then if any other revisions have been done, it will go 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth up the line, because many districts have done 8 or 9 revisions in some funding applications. Okay, next slide, please. So once you click on IDA, it will then take you to the section page. The section page is basically your home base. That's the page you want to go, and you can navigate pretty much anywhere through your IDA funding application using that page. At the very top of the page is the application status. It's very important that you look at that when you log in if you're wanting to make any kind of changes. If it says KDE IDA consultant approved, you cannot make any changes at that point. Right below that, though, it says change status to revision started. If you change that status, then you make changes. Or if it's the very original application, you need to change it to draft started. But as long as it's in an approved status, you cannot make changes. And so at the very top of the sections page is where you make that change on that. Also, you see it has a history log, a CEI participation information, which Jared would be able to help you with. And there's the allocations. If you click on that link, it would show you the allocations under 619 to 611. And if you're going to move funds for CEIS, that's the link you would go to move that to get 15%. Because you determine whether you're taking it from basic, preschool, or both on that. And then you see the IDA General. That has the personnel details and the PPA links on that. The only time you need to complete information or IDA General is on the original application. If you're doing revisions, you don't have to do anything with the IDA General section. And then there's the IDA Basic and IDA Preschool. And if you did CEIS, there will be another one right below that. But under those, you see budget. If you click on the budget link, it takes you to the budget page that shows you the object codes and the narratives that had been budgeted in the application. Budget overview takes you to the page and just shows you the object code and the amount. So it doesn't show you the narratives. It kind of gives you a running total and so forth on that. If you've done a revision, you can also go to the budget overview plus or minus. And what that will do, it will be the same as the budget overview, except for any that you've made changes, it will show in red the amount that you've deducted from the object code, and it will show you in green that you've increased on the object codes, any changes. So if you were looking back at historically what the PISTOS did, you can look at some of those revisions, and you can go to that budget overview plus or minus and see what they had changed in there. And then at the very bottom is a very important link. That is the IDA checklist. If you get an application returned from KDE not approved, you want to scroll down and click on that IDA checklist, and it will take you to a page that I'll show you a little bit later that will help you guide you on what you need to make changes in. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, application status. As I said at the top, it shows you the application status. If you are going to if you've got an original application, it will show not started. And so you would need to change status to draft started to make any changes in it. If it is a revision where it's already been KDE approved, then you would click on revision started. And the process is it's got to go through started, draft completed, to your finance officer, to the super before it comes to KDE. Next slide, please. Okay, two different views in which on the budget. You can do a category view, and if you look at that the screenshot there, it shows you that it's in school activities and then private school proportion amount. So you can look at those different ways. It must say modify next to it, though, if you're going to be able to make changes. If it doesn't say modify next to it, but it says simply view, then you don't have it in the correct status to make any changes. And then there's the object code view, in which it breaks it down by object codes that have been used in there. And again, it must have modify next to it in order to be able to make any changes. It doesn't matter which view. It's personal preference for you, whichever view you want to use, and make your change there. The important thing is you make sure if you're going to make changes, it says modify. If it doesn't say modify, it says view, then go back to the sections page and change the status. Next slide, please. Okay, all budget codes that are used must have a narrative. The system will not let you submit it if you have left out narratives on any of the object codes that you budget amounts for. Use descriptive narratives relevant to special education. Narratives are reviewed by KDE staff to ensure that allowable expenditures are used and reviews of items needing approval. Now, it's very important that you understand it needs to be detailed enough that anybody can understand, not just here at KDE. Because once you have approved funding application GMAP, it's public record. You don't have to have a login credentials to be able to look at your district's budget and narrative. So you want to be able to have the public look at it and view that these are things that are being used appropriately just from your narrative. Okay, next slide, please. Here's some examples of return effort example. Now, the last few years, we haven't had as many situations like this, but originally when people started, they were simply putting in very, very, very short narratives, and it really doesn't provide any information. And then the very bottom one is one of the reasons it usually does get returned in the recent fiscal years, and that's incorrect object code. But the narrative simply doesn't match what the object code is about. Next slide, please. Here's some examples, though, of approved narratives that you really don't have to write paragraphs and paragraphs. But for that 01 to 10, where they said certified staff, just simply if 3 special ed certified staff, 2 FMD, 1 LMBD. 0610 is one that is a very common one that a lot of districts try to use. It is a general supply code, which basically folders, papers, pens, and other office supplies. It may get returned if you try to put a lot of other supplies in there because there are more specific supply codes that you should be using. And those can be found in those KD resources with information on how to use that in the funding matrix and so forth. Okay, next slide, please. Some very helpful hints when you're doing your narratives and before you're submitting application is ask yourself, does the narrative relate back to the IDA and or special education students in some form? Second, could anyone read the narrative, not just somebody dealing with special education, anybody in the general public, and know exactly what the budget request is for? Would they know it was requested for the education and special education students? I mean, if you just simply put travel and some of those travel codes, and that was what was approved, then that could raise some red flags with people, and they would be giving you calls and emails and so forth. And then refer to the IDE funding matrix. There's one for private school and for public schools. There's one for CEIS also. And also the chart of accounts. The chart of accounts will give you more description of each of those object codes and specifically what would fall under some of those object codes. And those are both available in the KDE resources. Next slide, please. Okay, if your application is returned not approved, if it's returned not approved, both the DOS and the district finance officer will automatically get an email from the system, from GMAP, saying that KDE IDA consultant returned not approved. You would log in, you would go to that sections page, and then at the very bottom, click on the IDA checklist, and then it will take you to the IDA checklist page. And on the IDA checklist page, if you see the screenshot at the bottom, it will show either okay for sections that have been approved, or it will show attention needed. And the ones that has attention needed, there should be comments down there, and you may sometimes need to scroll down because it may be quite a few comments so that you see all of those. And that will tell you what you need to do to alleviate the problem, to fix the issue. Okay, next slide, please. And if you did that, you then would go back through the process after you made the changes of resubmitting it, and it goes through the finance officer and the superintendent before it come to KDE. On the section page, when you're working on an application, though, there's also what's called validation messages. All the way to the right on the section page, as a column says validation. And it may say messages under certain sections. Next slide, please. Those messages are two types. One is a warning, one is an error. The error will be in red font. The warning is just to check the system. It's asking you, are you sure you want to do this? It doesn't require any action. And so you don't have to make any changes. You can go ahead and submit it if they're all warnings. If it's an error, you cannot submit it. The system will not let you submit the application if there's an error. And so it must be corrected. And what you would do is you click on the review over there in the left column. It will take you to that section so that you can see what you need to change. It could be that you didn't, your budget didn't match up for the PSPA amount that you were supposed to have in there, or it may be contacts were not entered into the information, or it may be some other issue that you need to correct before it's submitted. Once all those errors have been cleaned up, then you should be able to forward and move it on to the finance officer and to the superintendent and to KDE. Again, if it's a warning, you don't have to do anything. If it's an error, you must do something. Next slide, please. Okay, you're now going to be going to the breakout rooms. And one of the things we want you to discuss is what are some actions that you can take in your district to ensure that the approved budget in GMAP matches the actual expenditures in units, which is referred to in PERP. GMAP, of course, is your proposed budget that has been approved. Munis is in your actual expenditures, and those should match up. So what you need to discuss then is what are some actions you can take into your district so that the budget that's been approved matches the actual expenditures.
Okay, great. So thank you, Gary, for that. Great session over GMAT. And so in your groups, did anybody have any great ideas about actions that you can take to assure that that approved budget that you got in GMAT is actually what happens in our Munis system? Did anybody have any great ideas for that? You can just unmute or put it in chat.
Yeah, in our group, we just kind of collectively stated that once our GMAP is approved, what I do is I typically print that out and give it to my finance officer, and so she knows how to set up Munis codes. I think somebody mentioned that their assistant finance officer is the one that helped them, but we all kind of had that same process.
Okay. And one thing that I would say too is having regular either monthly or bi-monthly checks on that to make sure that your budget in GMAP and Munis continue to align as you go throughout your year. So before we move on to our next section, thank you for sharing. Did anybody have any GMAP questions or questions for Gary? I can say it's a little scary when you get your GMAP report returned back to you unapproved, and it causes a little panic. But my experience in the district was that Gary and his team worked with us closely to make sure that we got those narratives outlined and got our budgets outlined really well. So, okay, Chris, I believe we are moving on to you.
All right, I'm going to assume Brindley is controlling the slides. Great.
Yes, sir.
You can just slide on down to the first one as the green banner at the top. There we go. The next one after that. My name is Chris Thacker, and Jared and I both worked on the maintenance of effort that local districts are required to meet under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. You all are probably familiar with Jonathan Compton, who used to be the person that worked most closely with local districts around that for the last few years. And I've kind of resumed my role in that since he left the office back at the end of June. So what is maintenance of effort? Maintenance of effort is the requirement that a district maintain its local effort or expenditures that it uses to educate children with disabilities. Its purpose is to ensure that the federal funds that you receive under the IEA are to benefit the special education population, and to support that state and local effort to make sure that it remains constant. So that's the supplement part. And it's also used to prevent federal funds from being replaced. We're using federal funds to replace state or local funds to provide special education. So that's the non-supplanting requirement of it. So if you hear people talk about maintenance of effort, it's just, are we continuing to spend as much as we always have from our state and local resources? Are we supplementing the amount of state and local funds that we spend with these IDA funds? And are we not using these IDA funds to replace or supplant those state and local funds that you use? So they're all kind of co-related to one another. And you see the regulatory site down there, 34 CFR 300-203. And as Steve mentioned, the 34 means it's U.S. Department of Education and the Code of Federal Regulations, and then 300 is the Part B regulations of the IDA. Okay, on to the next slide. There are two different types of MOE. One is called the eligibility standard, which is at 203A, and the other is the compliance standard at 203B. They're very similar, but eligibility looks at how much money am I budgeting for the year that's coming up out of my state and local resources, whereas the compliance standard looks back. How much did I spend the most recent year to do those same types of things? If you want to go on to the next slide. This is the actual regulation from the MOE for eligibility. Notice at the bottom there are those 4 bullets. Those 4 bullets represent the tests that are used to see if you've met the eligibility standard. It looks at local funds only that you've budgeted, and it looks at the combined total of state and local funds together. And then it looks at the per capita amounts of each of those. And you only have to pass one of those 4 tests or meet the threshold of one of those 4 tests to meet MOE. Now, we encourage you to meet as many of them as possible, but you have to meet one of them to pass the MOE, whether it be the MOE for eligibility or the MOE for compliance. Next slide, please. So when you're determining the amount of funds that you must budget, you have to look at what are the thresholds. When we're doing budgeted amounts, for example, we're in the middle of finishing up the 2024-25 school year MOE for eligibility. So we're looking, did you budget for the current year we're in right now an amount equal to the thresholds that were in place the last time we collected expenditure data and ran it through all the processes? So if you think back and at your 2024-25 MOE for eligibility document, that's year 5. Year 4 on that document is blank because we haven't collected the expenditure data for that year. Year 3 is the 22-23 school year, where we had the last time that we completed MOE for compliance. So the eligibility standard for budgeting for the year that we're in right now, 24-25, had to meet the thresholds that were in place after we went through that 22-23 school year for compliance. I'm going to go on to the next one. The MOE compliance standard does, as I said a while ago, looks at the expenditure. So we'll go back to the 2022-23 school year and look to see what were at the close of that, what were the amounts that we spent in each of those 4 tests. If we met the test in any of the 4 areas, that box would be green on your MOE calculator, and that sets the threshold for future years. If you failed that test, that box would be pink or red, and that means we'll have to go back up to the last year that you passed to see what the threshold was. But we have to look at expenditure. So when we send out in the spring of this year, the 2023-24 maintenance of effort for compliance, that blank year on your report that you have right now, it's going to be using the same thresholds that the MOE for eligibility for 24-25 use. So we're using the same base year for that terminology or that determination. You will go on to the next one. We have the same 4 tests. the total local funds, total combined state and local, and then the per capita amounts for each of those. Some of you may be thinking that in our general fund, we don't distinguish between local revenue or state revenue. It's just state and local combined together. But the IDA requires that the state education agency, us here at OSEEL, allow an LEA to meet the MOE requirements using local funds only. So how do we come up with that amount? As you're aware, under the state's SEEK funding formula, the Supporting Education Excellence in Kentucky, there is an add-on to that formula for special education. It's called the SEEK Exceptional Child Add-on, and that's based on child count from the prior year. And there's an amount that you receive under that SEEK funding formula for this particular purpose. To the extent that you spend your state and local funds out of the general fund, Fund 1, up to the amount of that SEEK Exceptional Child Add-on, that's considered state expenditures. When you exceed the amount of state funds you receive in a given year, that becomes local effort from the general fund. So that's how we distinguish between state and local funds out of Fund 1. There's also a Fund 2, which is our grants funds. It has a lot of federal grants in it, but we don't use federal funds. We only use state and local. So when we look at Fund 2, we would only look at state grants that you receive. And one state grant that every LEA receives is the state preschool grant. So we would look at that grant. There are a couple other grants that you might receive state funds for that you might spend special education or use to support special education, but only a handful of districts get those grants. But keep in mind, we do look at Fund 2 as well. You want to go on to the next one? Funds that may not be used to meet MOE. Well, we just talked about federal funds. So if you're looking at federal dollars, we don't consider those with MOE. We look to see how much state and local dollars that you are using for special education. To the next one. MOE exceptions, and this is the big thing that we have to think about, because when you fail those 4 tests, or if you don't meet any of those 4 tests, then you're going to fail MOE, whether that's MOE for eligibility or MOE for compliance. As the name implies, for MOE for eligibility, if you don't budget enough state and local funds to meet those thresholds across the 4 tests, then essentially you're planning to fail. And if you're planning to fail, then the interpretation of the IDA is then you're not eligible to receive federal assistance under the IDEA. So we want to make sure that when we're budgeting our state and local resources to provide special education in a given year, that we're going to budget enough to pass at least one of those 4 tests. Like I said, it only takes one. In expenditures, you have to go back and look, did I spend the amount required? So if I'm failing some of those tests, then I want to look at some exceptions. So what is an exception? An exception allows you to reduce the threshold that was required to meet one of those 4 tests. So if I'm looking at the total amount of state and local funds that you're required to spend in a particular year for special education, that's the threshold. I want to reduce that threshold if I didn't spend that much. So I'll go and look to see what are some exceptions I can take advantage of. I have a bulleted list there. If you go down to the very last bullet, the assumption of cost by the high cost fund operated by the SEA, that's an allowance under the IDA. However, Kentucky does not have a high cost fund that we operate. So that option isn't available in Kentucky. So it's just those first several that are available. The first one is probably the most popular one, and that's the voluntary departure of special education or related services personnel who were paid for during the year that threshold was set, or the most recent year, out of state and local funds, who left after the end of that year and were not there in the year that we're measuring. So when I'm looking at the 2023-24 test that's coming up, an exception might be a special education teacher that was there in 2022-23, paid for out of state and local funds, who retired. Did I replace that person? On the LEA MOE calculator, there's a tab called Exceptions and Adjustments for each of the years that we look at, but for that specific year, we would list on this table that special education teacher, their name and the reason they left, and then the amount of salary and benefits that you paid locally out of your state and local funds for that teacher. Then there's a table right below it where you would put who replaced that teacher. It should be a one-to-one match. So if you have a position on the top table, you'll have that same position on the bottom table. The difference is on the bottom table, you may not have replaced that person, but you need to put that position and indicate position not replaced. If you did replace it, then you put the position, the name of the person who replaced, and then the salary and benefits paid for that person during the year we're measuring. You only do this when the replacement person is less than the person that they replaced. If the replacement person is paid more, then don't enter that position into your exceptions and calculations, because essentially it adds to the threshold in that calculator. So you don't want to enter those. It is also critical that is a voluntary departure. You can't include staff who were let go because of a reduction in force. So you've got to be careful about what staff that you list there. And it has to be someone that was paid out of state and local funds during that preceding school year. So that's the most popular one that we have. The second one is a decrease in the enrollment of children with disabilities, your child count from one year to the next. So if you have fewer children in the year that we're measuring than you had in the year preceding, then we've got the opportunity to reduce the amount of the threshold for the various tests. And it will differ a little bit whether it's local funds only or state and local funds combined. But that one is purely based upon child count. The next one is the termination of obligation to provide special education to a child that is exceptionally costly. So if for example, you're placing a child in a special school somewhere the preceding year and you paid for that placement out of state and local funds, and now you're no longer required to provide the program for that child, then on this form, you enter that child's SSID number and the reason that we're no longer providing that service, and that's an exception. Termination of costly expenditures for long-term purchases. Long-term purchases are considered purchases that you paid for over at least 2 different fiscal years. So if you paid for it all in one year, it doesn't reach that threshold of being a long-term purchase. It's things paid over time. And then you only get to use an exception the last year where we met the threshold. How much did we pay on that long-term purchase? We enter that, and that amount becomes an exception for the subsequent year. So those are the exceptions that are allowed for this. There's something called an MOE adjustment, but we're not going to talk about those because those are highly specialized and would require probably a one-on-one conversation if we got into that. If you want to go to the next tab, please. And this is what it is, the MOE adjustments. Like I said, those are highly specialized, and we don't want to get into that because it can cause more confusion that we're able to address here in this short time. So you want to move on to the next one? Go on. The MOE calculator that I referred to previously, you'll notice the little logo there on the right for CIFER. CIFER is the Center for the IDEA Finance or Fiscal Reporting. It is a TA center funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, and they created this Excel workbook that has multiple different tabs on it that allows for the documenting of your expenditures year to year and indicating your budget in particular years, things of that nature that allows it to automatically calculate your status. If you want to go on to the next one, please. On that MOE calculator, this is kind of the primary tab that we look at. And you heard me talk about earlier green and red cells. These are the green and red cells. You look there in year 3, that was the last year that MOE for compliance was conducted. I also refer to the year 5 MOE for eligibility, the form that you have out there right now. So that year 5 will have some numbers in it that will be either green or red. And year 4 is blank. And that's because we've not done the year 4 compliance data yet. The reason we leave that row blank is so that you don't think you're going back to the budget amounts for year 4 to be your standard for year 5 budget amounts. The year 4 budget amounts are actually on that form that you have. And there's a cell there that says compliance standard and expenditures just to the right of 2024 that will allow you to change that and select the eligibility standard. And if you did that, that would populate and show you what you budgeted the prior year and your status at meeting tests. Going to the next one. Consequences for failure to meet MOE. If we're talking about failure to meet the MOE for eligibility, I kind of spoiled this one and told you earlier that if you're not budgeting enough, that means you're planning to fail. And if you're planning to fail, it's interpreted as you don't need the funds, so you're not eligible for the funds. If you fail MOE for compliance, you fail to spend the required amounts of money, and that's when we start digging in deep for exceptions, or did we make some errors in what we entered for the expenditures that particular year. So we try to go and do a lot of research, but because the last thing we want to do is to have to pay back funds. So that's the failure. If ultimately we've exhausted all revenue, all options through MOE exceptions or adjustments, or errors that may have been made in the form in the current year or past year, then ultimately the state has to pay back to the U.S. Department of Education the amount of the failure of the LEA to meet one of those 4 tests. If the state has to pay that money back to the OSEP, we got to pay for it out of state funds or funds that there's no federal obligation to. But we're going to probably collect that money from the LEA, and most likely would be a reduction in your SEEK funding, whether it be the SEEK Exceptional Child Add-on or the SEEK in general. There is opportunities for hearings and for things of that nature before that would occur. It just doesn't happen out of the blue. There would be ongoing dialogue and conversations between KDE and the district around the issue to try to resolve it before taking that extreme step. Going to go on to the next one. All right. I think that's pretty much the conversation around maintenance of effort. No 2 circumstances are identical when we talk about from LEA to LEA. Your situations are unique to you. The things that occur there are going to be different. So we're here to work with you on an individual basis as needed. I will say when it comes to MOE for eligibility, the budget amount, budgets do not set thresholds for future years. So when we look at that MOE for eligibility, it may be that you budgeted an amount that you didn't live up to. Well, it's not whether you lived up to that budgeted amount. It's when we do MOE for compliance, we'll come back to see, did you spend the threshold that you're required to spend that year based upon the threshold, not to that budget. The budget is just the plan. This is what we plan to spend. We plan to spend enough to meet the thresholds, and generally you're going to plan to spend probably a little bit more. So there might be a little bit of a window. Then some exceptions can come into play in the reality of your actual expenditures as we move to that year. So there may be some differences that occur there. I think that we are ready for questions. And these are the questions for the breakout room, Ridley.
So Chris, just really quickly, can you talk to when MOE notifications are sent out to districts and how they're sent out?
When we do the MOE, there's, like I said, there's 2 different ones. The MOE for eligibility, the MOE for compliance. We do them both each year. Prior to this year, for the MOE for eligibility, if a district met any of those 4 tests, we never notified the district. We had the data from the working budget that we capture from all districts, and we put it into the MOE calculator. If you meet, you'll never hear from us. This year, we opted to go ahead and send it out to everyone. We send it out in the late November, December timeframe because of the going through the process. The budget itself is being entered prior to July 1. But going through the working budget and getting it finalized so that we can capture it and populate the forms takes a while. So that comes out November, December. We're about to finalize that one right now. The MOE for expenditures for the 23-24 school year that we're talking about, we use the audited annual finance report data. That those audits don't get completed generally to the end of November, but as you can imagine, there's always a number of districts that don't quite have it finished yet. So we wait until every one of the LEAs have that data available, and then we'll send those out. The plan is to send those out in April or May so that we will be confident that the data we have is finalized and accurate at that time.
And before we go out into breakout rooms too, I will say if you are a brand new dose, like you just started this year, this is probably sounding very overwhelming and something you've not worked with a lot. This is being recorded so that when you do get your MOE and you do look at whether you met or did not meet in certain areas, you can go back to this. But I encourage you, when MOEs are to be reviewed, sit down with your finance officer and do that together. So you both have a really good working knowledge of what is in the MOE and what those costs are, what those exceptions are, and that type of thing.
I might add to that, Alicia, we also do a session at the Kentucky Association of School Business Officers. There's a meeting in the fall and one in the spring. We're going to be doing a very similar presentation at both of those. We did the presentation at the DOSE Institute. This is a collaborative effort between the Director of Special Education and that finance staff because of the fact that we are looking at money and budgets and things like that. So it's a combination of program staff and fiscal staff that need to work on this together and realize and understand that the IDA does have those specific fiscal requirements that Steve touched upon in his session earlier and what I've discussed here on this topic.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, Brindley, we are ready to go back to breakout rooms. Would anybody want to share out any of the things that you discussed in your breakout room, or if you have any additional questions after going into your breakout room and maybe working toward answering these?
In my breakout group, we just talked about that some of our common exceptions are the changes in staff. You know, and I just shared a couple of years ago, I had some very seasoned special ed teachers, 27, 29 years of experience retire. And when you replace those with brand new, you know, that's a huge difference in salary. That's really one of probably the piece that kind of changes our MOE is that staff changeover.
Yes.
Other pieces that we kind of look at too would be any specific kid equipment purchases that have been made in one particular year that you don't continue to make because you met the need or whatever.
I think those are great examples. You know, if you have a student who has significant needs and they graduate, and then so you no longer have a need to provide all of those services, that could be another example. So, okay. All righty. If we don't have any more questions or anybody else wants to share, we will move on. Jared and Donnell, do you both have this one, or is this just Darnell?
It's Darnell with me sitting here looking pretty and chiming in every now and then.
Love it. Okay.
Okay, I'm Darnell McIntosh. I'm a retired finance officer, retired in 18 and then joined this fiscal monitoring team. And we done a pilot districts, we done about 4. And then after that, we've been doing this for about 4 years. So this is our 4th cycle. And so we've seen a lot in the districts. We've seen a lot of good things going on in Kentucky. Whenever we go in, one of the things that we do is we ask for munis access. So we try not to bother you guys as much as we can. There's some things that we can't get out of munis. So those things, naturally, we have to do document request and request that from you. But so we've seen a lot of good things, a lot of good record keeping. I mean, some things are just really easy to follow. But what we're going to talk about today is I've got about 5 slides, and we're just going to talk about the things that's really common that we see in most every district. And so we just kind of want to give you guys a heads up so that you can kind of get this stuff corrected if it's something that's would be a non-compliant in your district before we come. Whenever we've done this districts, we've had a cap in every district. So just know that, you know, there's just a lot of things that we're looking at and a lot of things you may not know that you're supposed to be doing. And whenever we come, we help you. I mean, we're not here to get you or anything. We're here just to help you and just to make for sure that Kentucky is being compliant in this grant, because we definitely have to have this special education funding for our state. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And Jared and Chris, whenever I go through this, if you think of something else, because you guys have been helping as well with this, if there's something that I missed that's a big topic, just please chime right in. Okay, next slide. Okay, one of the things that we find and in the districts, and this is very common, most everybody gets a write-up in this one, is the budgets and expends. We're just looking to make for sure that you're spending your funds in accordance with the IDEA regulations. And the first thing there is Section 504. We see Section 504 discharges in most districts, and Section 504 is not a special education cost. That has to be charged somewhere else in the budget. It cannot come under special ed, it can't be under the grant, or it cannot be under the Fund 1 MOE charges. You can't do it in either place. So just be sure that your district is not charging Section 504 to special education.
So Darnell, if I could, one of the most common that we're seeing is obviously what she just said, 504, and the other one that we're seeing a lot of folks charging physical restraint and seclusion training.
Yes.
So those are probably the top two things that we see in that area.
Mm-hmm. And then other things, you know, is like we'll have a special education teacher that may do other things, and that she or he goes to a conference and it's not a special education conference. So we kind of see that too. And then just overall, or there's some spending that should not be special ed. It's actually for all the children. So, and you can prorate things like that. But a lot of times it just gets 100% charged to special education. The next thing we see is expenditures out of the period of availability. I haven't seen that as much this year. Last year we've seen it a lot. What happens with this one, the most common thing that happens is travel. A teacher will travel somewhere and they don't turn their travel in. They'll hold it. I know in my district we had teachers that would want to hold it to like Christmas or vacation and just turn all of their travel in at one time so they would get a big check. Well, whenever they do that, the grant that you intended for that money to come out of may be closed. And so you just take it out of your next grant. And then you look at the dates of the grant as to when they can spend that money, and it's out of that period of availability. So that's something to watch for. I have noticed that some districts actually have in their policy, they'll say that the travel has to be turned in like within 30 days. And that's probably why they got that there, because they've had issues with that in the past. So just be sure if someone turns their travel in late and you're paying it, that you pay it out of the right grant, because you may have it coded to one grant, you may have to change it to another grant. Another thing that we've seen in that one is like if a grant is closed and then you overspend it, and so you're having to move expenditures around, and you actually move an expenditure that to the next year's grant, and it may not be in that period of availability. Whenever I say period of availability, it's actually the year of the grant. It's like this year we're monitoring the 23 year. That grant started July 1 of 2022, and you have to have it encumbered by September 30th of 2024, and then it has to be spent by December of 2024. So that whenever I say period of availability, that's the date that the grant is available for you to spend. But those are the common things that we see with that one. The next thing is GMAP and Munis budgets do not match, which I know you've kind of talked about that, Gary has, and that was part of your breakout session. But that is probably, we've seen that in, I would say 95% of the districts. You look at that and it just does not match. And GMAP budget is the one that's approved, so that's your official budget. It doesn't matter what your finance officer has in Munis, that's not an approved budget. It's your GMAP budget. So that GMAP budget has got to get into Munis, or you're not going to know if you're in compliance or not. And I think what happens with that a lot is GMAP is approved in July, but the finance officer's working budget is not approved until September. So they're not really working on that budget at that time. They're doing it in September. So I think it just gets to be forgotten about, because I know as a finance officer, a lot of times you will roll your budgets over. And then like if your grant increased, like say $1,000, you'll just go in there and update something to make the revenue and the expenses balance. But we've got to get that GMAP budget in there, or you're just not going to know what you can spend your money on. The next thing is expenditures and codes that were not approved in GMAP. We see that a lot. There's a code that's 0610, that's a supply code. We see that overused and coded incorrectly. Sometimes like even furniture or computers, there's codes for furniture and computers, and we'll see that coded to 610. I think a lot of times that code's not open, so they just put it in 610, and you can't do that. 610 should mainly be used for consumable supplies, because all this other stuff, your books, like say computers, furniture, all of those things have their own codes, and you got to be using those codes. And if you get in there and you realize, okay, hey, I do need to buy a computer or furniture and I don't have it approved in GMAP, you can do a budget revision. Just get with Gary on that, and he can help you through that process and get it approved in GMAP before you spend the money. Another thing is the GMAP budget categories exceeding 10% of the total budget. What we do with this one to check is we add up both grants, your basic and your preschool, and you can go over 10% of that. And what we do is we just do like a spreadsheet, and every category that's over, we'll put that out there, and then we'll add it all up. A lot of districts are going over like 25 and 30%. And a lot of it is just because they don't have a code open. And we just see that so much. A lot of districts are having issues with that because I think part of the issue is they don't have the right budget in Munis. So if you just run a Munis report, it may look like you're okay, but whenever you put that GMAP budget in there, you're not okay. And I know as doses, you may or may not have access to Munis. If you don't have access, just ask someone in finance to run you a report, and they can run it different ways. If you want to see it in what we call detail, you can run it in detail, and it'll show you like every vendor that's been paid, the check number and the amount, the purchase order. You can see that. So that's probably important that you work with your finance department and make sure that you also have access to that as well, because the finance, they've just had so many grants to deal with. They may not be looking really closely at your grant, and then, that might be something that you can do that would help to make for sure that everything stays in compliance.
So Darnell, if I could just here really quickly, I want to clarify for folks that 10% would apply to like the 500 series or the 600 series. That's that 10% variance that you can have. Mm-hmm. What we'll see a lot of times is folks, as Darnell has said, Munis doesn't match GMAP or Enterprise ERP. I've got to get in the habit of calling it the Enterprise ERP instead of Munis. But that's one of those things that if that's 10% off, more than 10% off. And we know if finance directors are on here, we know you click that rollover button. And what I've suggested, and I know some of my districts are on here, they know that I'm a little bit of a hawk where this is concerned. I look at it pretty closely. And I will tell you, there will be a process we're going through in the state where, again, I know it's hard to understand sometimes. We genuinely are here to help. So if you get a note that says, hey, your GMAP doesn't match your Munis or your Enterprise ERP report, we're going to have someone who's going to be tasked with looking randomly at those starting with this next year. So we're going to be there to kind of try to catch it. So that's where that's concerned. Darnell, we've got a question in the chat.
Okay.
If we're not sure what code something would fall under even after reading the matrix resources, who could we ask? Well, you can ask Chris or me, or Carla Miller in our office. That's a question like you could email us and say, hey, we've got this expenditure and we're not quite sure. We try to make that matrix as specific as possible, but I will tell you, we just have gotten into a couple districts that have really overused 610. So that you got to be really careful about what you code where.
And look at that chart of accounts too. It gives you descriptions on what each of those codes are, and it breaks them down in on there too.
Chris, are you with us? We lost Chris. Koya, we'd be happy to talk to you about that question offline if that's an option.
Okay. Jared, do you have anything else on that one? We pretty much covered that, I don't think. Okay, if you want to go on the next slide. Okay, this is an area also that we see a lot of non-compliance in. It's the private school proportion amount. If you have private schools in your districts, if you don't have any private schools, then this won't apply to you. But most districts have at least one private school, or they'll have a homeschool that's a private school. So if you look, whenever you do your GMAP, there's going to be an allocation that you're going to give your private schools, and it's basic and in preschool. So you can look at that to see what that allocation is. And Munis has it set up to where you can use a project code of 337. X is just like a holding place. It's like, but this year we're monitoring the J grant, and you guys are probably actually spending the L grant now. So that's each year it just goes up, like one year's A and the next year's B and C and so forth. And so we just put an X there if it's just a generic. So that's kind of why that X is there. But it will be like 337. This year we're monitoring J, so it'll be like 337 JP. The P at the end of it stands for the private schools. And then if it doesn't have a P after it, that's just the public schools. So that's just the way that we can separate the money. We see some districts that don't use this at all, so they're not separating their public from their private. So whenever we ask them, how much money did you spend on your private school children? They don't really know because they're not separating it. They may be spending too much. If the private schools aren't needing speech services, they may just be giving it to them, or they may not be doing nothing at all. We don't know that. So it's real important that you use the correct project number to separate those two things from the public to the private. Now, if the private schools don't spend their money and it's at the end of the grant, you can spend that on your public kids, but you have to give the private school a chance to spend that. And most of the time what we see is speech. They want speech services. So it's usually a speech, but every once in a while we'll see something different that's been requested. So it's really important that you do that. And then what we do to check that is we'll ask for the service logs. And like I say, most time it's a speech pathologist, so we'll ask for those service logs. And then we'll just check it. We'll just see how much he or she's hourly rate is, and just see if it works out. If it's in the ballpark, we're probably going to be okay with it. But a lot of times it's not. I mean, they're either overspending or they're underspending. And a lot of times we'll see that for the private school, like if they have an allocation of like $2,000, somebody will just do a journal entry and just charge that grant $2,000. They're not, so they don't even know what they're spending. And if you're not required to spend anything more. If your budget's $2,000, that's all you have to do. If you do end up spending more, you can do that, but you have to take it out of general fund. You can't take it out of this grant. So just kind of keep that in mind. Okay, the next slide. The next slide is on inventory. Some districts have an inventory, but it's not, they'll just want to inventory things like technology items. Or what's in Munis, like whatever their capital threshold is, it may be like $5,000, and they'll just inventory the things that's over $5,000. But if you look at the CFR and actually look at what's required in this for special education funds, it's basically anything that is non-consumable has to be inventoried. It doesn't have to be a Munis, but it does have to be on a spreadsheet or some information that we can see that you've got an inventory. And you can look there at that last paragraph on the slide. I won't read all that, but that's what's required on your inventory. We actually done just like a little simple spreadsheet that we can share with anybody, but it's just got the titles at the top. And we actually added some stuff in there that we thought would be helpful, but it's not required. but these are the things that's actually required on your inventory. And it's so important, guys, to have an inventory. In my district, we had a flood one time in one of our school districts. It was just a small school, and they didn't have a good inventory. And the insurance company asked us, like, what was in the school? So the teachers went back and just done things from memory. We turned all that in. Years later, they was coming up with things. Oh, we forgot about this. We forgot about that. I know a popcorn machine was one of the things that come to mind. The school pop, they got ready for a ball game. They didn't have their popcorn machine. So, it's like, okay, we didn't turn that in. So, we didn't get that replaced. And there's just so many things that happen to a school building that if you don't have an inventory, you just don't know what was there. So just keep that in mind that you do have to have an inventory. If you don't have an inventory at all right now, you can just go ahead and start one. And you could have your teachers like do an inventory of what's in their classroom. Do the best you can with it. We know that you won't have dates and you may not have everything, but if they have a table in there that's a special ed fund that they knew that come from special education, just put table on there. Just put something on your inventory. It may not be complete, but just put something on there. And then going forward, then you'll have all this information, and you go forward with it. You are required to do a inventory at least once every 2 years. A lot of districts that do have an inventory will do it yearly, and that's fine. But with special education funds, just remember that you have to do it at least once every 2 years. Okay, the next slide is procurement. We don't have a lot of problems with procurement. It's hard for us to check actually procurement because we're only looking at one grant. We're not looking at your whole district. So most of the time what we're checking is for your contractors. A lot of times districts will contract out things like speech or OT and things of that nature. They won't have their employees, but they'll have contractors that do that. And most of Kentucky is under model procurement, so we'll talk about that one. With model procurement, you don't have to bid it out. You don't even have to do quotes because, it's for services, and that's fine. But model procurement does say that you need a written documentation. We need to know why that you chose the vendor that you chose. Just as simple as that. If you can just write up why you done that, put it with your contract, and we come, just give us that. But you do need to be checking, check the cost. See if you've been using somebody forever, check with your neighboring districts or with the co-op. If you're part of a co-op, a lot of times the co-op will do that for you. And just check to see, you may be overpaying, you may be underpaying, you want to keep that person. So, just keep that in mind too, that you're paying, around the same rate as your neighboring districts are, especially if they're a good person, because you wouldn't want them to leave. Those people are hard to find. Okay, and our next slide. Okay, this one, Chris has already talked about MOE, but we're going to touch on the Fund 2. He sort of touched on this a minute ago. Fund 2 just recently started getting pulled into the MOE calculator. I'm not sure what year he started doing that, but it's just been in the last few years. Because when we started monitoring, we started finding some stuff in the Fund 2 grants that's actually special education that's not getting coded to special education. And so, like he talked about, the state preschool grant is a big one. So we started pulling in the state preschool grant into MOE. Now, whenever that grant gets pulled in, we've seen this done several different ways. Sometimes there's a key code of 006, I think, is special education. So that one, sometimes the whole grant is coded to 006. So everything gets pulled in. And we know that the state preschool grant serves all children. It doesn't serve just special education kids. It's a mixture of kids. So that one gets pulled in, or they'll code it all to non-special education. We know, and then sometimes that can be okay if those children are getting pulled out for services, or you've got a special education teacher that's coming in and teaching the things that's in the IEP. But in most cases, the state preschool teacher is certified to where they can teach special education and non-special education kids. And what's happening is in the IEP, there's things that's written in there. Now, if it's speech, the speech teacher comes in and takes care of that. But if it's something other, like in the regular instruction classroom, and those children are getting pulled aside, and they're getting this extra instruction based on what's in their IEP. If the state preschool teacher is doing that, then that's a special education cost, and we're not capturing that. So that is a problem that we've got going on. We also see that with KEXAC. Not every district has KEXAC, but that's another big one. They'll have some special education teachers that's not coded to special education. There's a mental health grant that's out there. And this is really common that the districts are coding all of that to special education. And again, that's not just for special education children, it's for all of the kids. KEXAC has a code of 0281. We're not seeing that used very often, but that's to capture the special education cost. And like I say, the last paragraph there talks about the key code of 006, and that is to capture the special education costs. And 001 is for the non-special education cost. This is a big one. We're working on this to hopefully we can simplify this. We're thinking a lot about this, what we can do to make this simple. Right now we have a spreadsheet that we're asking districts to do, and we're really trying to come up with something a little simpler than what we have been. But just know that that's an issue. If there's special education cost in the state preschool grant or in KEXAC, that we've got to capture that on the MOE as well.
So let me just chime in here if I can, Darnell. And
Okay.
Chris and I have been working on a way, like Darnell said, to kind of simplify the calculation, because believe it or not, the guidance that's out there actually says Kara preschool, if that tells you about the age of the guidance that's out there. Some of us were around when Kara started. Not going to point a finger or anything. But anyway, so what we're doing is Chris is actually going to be and I'll be at one or two of these, talking to preschool directors next month in their RTC directors meetings about the new way we're going to propose looking at this and calculating this. Right now, it's very laborious, to be perfectly frank. But the fact of the matter is we think we've found a way to kind of capture some data that you all will know. Doses, it'll be based on December 1 counts. And so that way we get that snapshot in time for preschool. Those of you all who have dual roles, it'll make it a little easier for you too. But the fact of the matter is, what folks are doing is they're paying 100% for folks with IDEA funds when they have a blended program. And if you should be doing a split, if you got a 60-40 or what have you, and there's a whole calculation that Chris has put in there for us based on the weighted amounts under the special education, pardon me, add-on that will capture that. I don't want to go too far into it, but what I will tell you, the process is about to get quite a bit more simple. And the fact of the matter is if you are coding folks 100%, that's not, and you've got a blended program, that's not the way it should be done. As I used to say when I did, some of y'all probably remember back when I did RTI a couple years ago, just smile and nod and know that there's some updates coming and some information coming. We're presenting at CASBO. We're going to the RTCs to talk to the preschool directors, and we will be also rolling that out to everyone at some point. So we're working on it. Just understand that we're going we're really, this is one of those things we found, and we want to make sure that you all have a simple way to be able to approach this.
Okay, that's the common findings that we have found in our districts. I mean, we do look at a lot of other things, but these are the things that we have the most issues with. I didn't do a slide on PARS, but probably should have done that one as well. But a lot of districts do the PARS, some doesn't. So that's another thing that that we can discuss later. But just know that that there's a lot of things that we're looking at, and these are the most common things that we're finding.
PARS being personnel action reports, for those of you all new to the lingo. You need those to say time and effort. And let's say that you've got folks that are split funded. You've got to be able to document the amount of time that they're spending on special education and non-special education time. That can include you all as doses. So if you've got multiple hats, and I know none of you all wear multiple hats, I'm not being facetious in the least. But even if your own job has that. You should have a PAR in place, a personnel action report, a time and effort documentation that says this is the amount of time and my salary gets paid at 90-10, 90% IDEA, 10% towards, let's say, safe schools or something like that. That should be documented somewhere in the system. And again, smile and nod. And we'll be at CASBO and we'll be doing presentations and we'll be doing those things to kind of get that information out to you all.
But here's a couple of questions that Jared done for the breakout sessions. What sort of policies, practices, and procedures do your district have related to IDA fiscal requirements, and who monitors fiscal compliance and best practices, and how do you as a DOS know it's being monitored?
Great, thank you. So based on the questions that were asked, does anybody want to share any ideas for who's monitoring fiscal compliance, or what practices you have in your district that might benefit all the other members here today? Okay. Don't see anybody super eager to talk or hear anybody. So I think if you have, we like to do our takeaways. So if you have a takeaway from what's been shared so far is that you need to be working closely with your finance director. B, you need to be paying attention that your GMAP matches your Munis reporting. And those three letters that I don't know yet, because that was before those were not there before. And then also that you're looking at it, that you're monitoring it ongoing throughout the year. It's not a one and done event that happens. You do your budget, you put it away, and then you just function. You're constantly looking at it. So just remember those. And then Steve, we're going to go back to you to just kind of include some additional areas we have not talked about yet. And then close out with Brenda with leadership.
All right. Thank you, Alicia. So I'm going to go really quick through this information. You have it all on the slides. And it's important, but not as important as what the information you've just been talking about. In terms of needing to know right now. So state grants, you get two. You get a Part B Section 611 grant, which is for all things special ed ages 3 through 21. So it's not just school age. You'll often hear it school age. It's not just school age. It's ages 3 through 21. Part B Section 619 is not just preschool. It's ages 3 through 5. So it includes those 5-year-olds who are in your kindergarten classrooms. You get 27 months from the date that it's made available until you can no longer obligate it. So it's not a 12-month cycle. It's a 27-month cycle. Those bullets there kind of break it out into the different parts of the cycle. And so you could potentially, during a specific 3-month period, have 3 different 611 grants and 3 different 619 grants available to you at the same time. So it's very important that you're in communication with your finance, your business office, to make sure that you're spending the oldest money first and all those things. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm not going to get into this slide at all because it's basically how the federal government determines how much money the state receives. Let's go to the next slide. And then this slide is really about money that the state gets to use for their operations and to support you all. You can take a look at that at your leisure. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the same thing for the Section 619. This is how the state gets their money. So we're not going to go through that because of time. Let's go to the next. And there's option for the state to do some things at the state level with their money. The next slide. So this is the subgrants that you get from the state. You have to establish eligibility. There was a lot of discussion about the application and how that process works. That's how you establish eligibility. Your component of your grant are not your child count. That's a common misconception. You get a base payment, which is what you received as an LEA back in 1999. So it's really old, the base payment piece. Then there's the population, the size of your district, how many children, not children with disabilities, but children overall. That's 85% of the remaining funds. And then 15% of the remaining funds is for the number of children in poverty relative to the rest of the state. So if you're a bigger district, you get more in the population. If you're a poorer district, you get more in the poverty. And then all LAs are eligible, even if you've never had a child with disability. Let's go to the next slide. Very similar for Section 619 subgrants, so we're not going to go there. Next slide. So this slide, I'm not going to go into the details of any of these because of time, but these are kind of the big areas of IDA fiscal requirements, right? You have requirements around how you can use the amount of funding, excess costs, allowable costs, so what can you spend the funds on, maintenance of effort, which you heard a lot about already, coordinated early intervening services, which is the voluntary use of up to 15% of your IDA grant to provide services to children who are at risk in K-12. Comprehensive CEIS, this is what you have to do with your 15% if you have significant disproportionality. And then there's proportionate share and equitable services, which you heard a little bit about in the monitoring piece. So those are the kind of the main things. And we're going to skip right through these slides because these are slides that go into detail about those. This slide right here, if you ever are confused when you see CEIS or CCEIS and you want to know what's which, this slide compares them both and it kind of points out where they're the same and where they're different. The bold language is different pieces. Okay, next slide. Yeah, go. Okay, and this is resources for IDA fiscal topics that are put out by the Office of Special Education Programs or their technical assistance centers. And then that bottom one has great information about how different states fund special education with their state dollars. And I think that was my last slide.
Thank you, Steve. Brenda, give me just a second. Jared did have a link, I believe, to the resource page.
Yeah, I did, Alicia. I just really quickly put that over there a minute ago. That is, and we're building resources as we go. That is actually our upload portal for districts if they do have to upload as part of a monitoring visit. Not wishing that on anyone. We love you, but no offense. But people will get chosen. We have a way, have a risk assessment tool. But that is a resource page that we're constantly adding to that includes everything from inventory sample sheets to sample personnel action reports to the MOE sheets and the whole 9 yards. As we go, things will be added to this page. So click on that, feel free to bookmark that, and we will be adding items over time as resources. Eventually hope to build out our own physical page with those resources on it specifically.
Great. Thank you so much, Jared. Okay, Brenda. Brenda has our leadership takeaway for us this afternoon.
Perfect. Thank you, Alicia. And I guess now is when I say, and now for something completely different, because we've been in the world of fiscal for nearly the last 2 hours, and I want to do something a little bit different for the leadership takeaway today. Often when we talk about leadership, we're focusing on, communication or what's your leadership style. And as I kind of molded over, I wanted to talk about personnel issues, personnel management, because unfortunately, as much as you'd like to spend your time in your roles doing kind of that fun program implementation kind of leadership stuff, personnel issues often take up a large amount of time. And you're often finding yourself in a position where you're balancing, as a leader, you're a mentor to folks on your team. You're there to support them, to help them grow. But you're also in a supervisory role where you do need to take action sometimes on personnel issues. And so I just have a couple of slides. And the first thing I like to think about when I'm trying to balance that mentor or supervisor role is asking myself when something's going on staff is whether or not that person's behavior is affecting the team's ability to complete its objectives. And that's kind of like a good balance on, okay, is this mentoring or does this need to be the next step to become some kind of personnel management thing? Is the team's ability to complete the objectives being affected? Because you don't want to sit on something that is hampering your team, bringing morale down, or causing any kind of those negative things. So when the answer to that is yes, then you need to take some steps. And so just a couple of pointers. Make sure you're very familiar with your LEA, your district's personnel management policies. And so when you do need to take any kind of action, you know those next steps, you know, whatever your district has outlined as far as like a letter of warning or some kind of performance improvement plan. Make sure you know what that policy is and how to do those steps. Make sure you're building relationships with your HR personnel. They are a huge asset to you when you are dealing with those personnel issues. They can sit in with you on meetings with a staff member if need be. They can help you write up a performance plan. They can help point you to, you know, areas in the policy that you might not be familiar with and help you locate resources that are available to you in your district. And then just the other thing that I highly encourage any supervisor to do is to clearly document communication with any employee. Even if you haven't said, yes, this person's behavior is affecting the team, if you're just like doing some mentoring steps and there's the potential it might be something bigger, you want to start documenting that early, and hopefully, you know, nothing happens. You don't have to take it to any kind of formal disciplinary measures or anything. But if you do, then you have documentation that you can share with HR and that you can use to kind of build those performance review processes. I don't, when I say clearly document, what I like to do and what I strongly advise a lot of people to do, you know, usually you talk personally to, you know, someone when you're trying to help them correct behavior or, you know, come in line with a policy or make sure they're doing procedures correctly. You want to have that conversation personally. So what I like to do is after that conversation at the end, I just let the person know, hey, I'm gonna write up a summary of what we talked about and email it to you. And then that way you have an email document of, hey, we talked about this, this, and this on this date. It's got the timestamp on there because it was emailed. And so if you do need to like build some documentation later on with HR, you have that email to do so. Next slide, Brinley. One thing I like to remind myself when I get in these situations, and you know, it's kind of funny, often personnel issues are the things that cause us the most stress as leaders. And I had a coworker share this quote with me a few years ago, and I don't know who originally said it, but it is stuck in my mind, and I remind myself of this all the time, that good leaders are comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. And anytime I'm going into one of those situations that might be a little bit dicey, I like repeat this quote to myself several times, that it is my role as the leader, as the supervisor, to be comfortable talking about these things that most people are uncomfortable with, because someone needs to take that role and make sure that people are progressing or that behavior that shouldn't be happening in the workplace is not going to continue. So make sure you're comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations. And then just for the last slide, Brinley, if you'll move us forward, probably like 15, 18 years ago, when I was in my very first supervisor role, I was overseeing crossing guards. I was sent to a supervisor training, and they talked about, you know, these 3 T's, and they have stuck with me. So I'm going to pass them on today, that when you're dealing with a personnel issue, ask yourself, can I train or retrain this person? And so let's go over the procedures again. This is what you're supposed to do, and then see if that improves behavior and job performance. If that's not working, you can take a look and say, is there another position this person may fit better in? And then you could transfer them to the different position. And if you've kind of looked at those 2 things and that's not working, then you need to kind of consider termination of the employee. So if termination's coming up, I always ask myself, has this person had adequate training? Have we retrained? Have we considered different positions for them? And then, you know, I put terminate on this slide because it's one of the 3 T's, but I'm going to put that caveat in that terminate, or you're following your district's personnel plan. So that might be some kind of disciplinary plan or some kind of performance improvement plan. And so that's when you're getting to those steps. You've done the training, you can't transfer them, or you have, and it's not working. So those are my takeaways for today. Alicia, I'll turn it back to you, but if anybody else has any other quotes or any other nice things to throw in the chat around dealing with personnel issues that have helped you, feel free to share it with the group.
Great. Thank you so much, Brenda. And thank you to the entire team who presented today. I think, again, a lot of great information. These sessions are recorded. So if you need to go back and revisit any area to kind of make sure you heard it correctly or take some more notes, they'll be posted on the DOSE one-stop site and the preschool coordinator one-stop site probably within a week or so. And so if you'll take a minute to fill out the survey. I do look at those. I read every response. Just thank you for being here today. And I hope you stay warm and you stay safe.